Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Recollection Step, a Grand Archive TCG podcast, part of the Maindeck podcast family. I'm Dan.
And I am Taylor. And today we're going to be going over water in our series here of kind of basic element overviews. And it's water's turn this time. So we'll be diving into that and kind of all the fun things you can do with water cards. But before that, Dan, how have you been?
Taylor, I've been all right. We just got out of our store champs last weekend where you and I were competing at the same time. That's probably the biggest Grand Archive news for us, as I'm not going to be at Chicago. You guys have been deep in preparation, the Maindeck competitive team. Taylor, how did your store champs go?
My store champs, it went pretty, it was good. It was good. I played Tristan. Haven't played that deck at all yet. So that was sweet. I just picked it up. It seemed like it was fun. And then I won round one.
You're really burying the lead here.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That was the plan. But you kind of ruined it. So
yeah. Well, come on now, get to the point.
Well, okay. Yeah, I won our store champs. So that was sweet.
There we go.
Yep, took that home, which was great. Felt really good to finally have a store champs under my belt. Yeah, like I said, I played Tristan. Tristan was pretty dope. That deck it's grindy, but man, is it fun to play. Holy cow. I don't know if I'm going to play it ever again though, because you've got to be, not only do you have to be playing really quickly in order to like finish your matches on time, your opponent does too. Like you're at such risk of all your rounds going to time and ending up with like 9 draws over the course of an ascent.
Yeah. So for store champs, you've I think in our local store champs, you've kind of been always a bridesmaid, never a bride. Is that right?
Actually, no. So
I can't remember.
Our first store champs, I didn't even get to attend because I was out of town or something that weekend.
I
got scheduled. The second one, I think I made it to like our top 4, just our initial top cut, and then I lost to Mitch right away.
Yeah,
and then.
Had
one more.
We did. We had one more where your deck list was not optimal.
That was so bad. That's right. Oh my God. I was messing around with like Wind Crux during that season, the ALC season store champs. And at one point I had taken out Lorraine and put in Merlin. I had put Lorraine back in. I had taken out Prismatic Edge, and then in Ascensions. And then for our store champs, I was like, okay, I'll put Prismatic Edge back in because that card's dope in Ascensions. And I put the Ascensions into my list, but I did not put Prismatic Edge. So that was rough.
Yeah, that was kind of lacking. And you were like, you're running the Prismatic like off element cards in there too, right?
I was, yeah. I had water cards in there as well.
The deck was pretty far from optimal at that point. And yeah, it didn't go super well for you, if I recall, but you kind of made it up with this one.
Oh yeah.
You had a particular take on Tristan that I really enjoyed hearing when you completed the tournament. I don't know if you want to share that with people about your future prospects with the character.
Yeah, that was a never before, never again situation like that. It's just we're like The Rock coming back to WrestleMania. In 2012, which means, of course, I'll probably be picking up Tristan again in the future. But no, it was a lot of fun. It was a good time. I just took Caven's list that he was playing in the regionals because, why not? Dude knows what's up.
Dude knows what's up.
I threw in a spicy Diablerie.
Yeah.
One of. Perfect card to play like as a one of in your store champs, by the way, just because like you don't have to worry about people seeing your list over the course of a long event and then knowing about it. Like no one knows to play around it. And even if they know, like they're not going to actually play around it because it's also Star Champs. And it's just a lot of fun to play. Like it's perfect. And actually in Tristan mirrors, you get them stolen. You get your spicy one of stolen by a Shadow Reaver anyway, so it doesn't matter.
I was gonna bring that up because I came over and I think this is in top 4. I bubbled out with wind slimes. I actually have a tweet thread talking about it. You can check that out if you want. I'm not gonna go into it. I really like my wind slime list. I had a really rough first round where my hands were just like some of the worst Sylvie hands I've ever had in my life. So it didn't go awesome. I was the one soul bubble, but I was watching. Well, I was in and out of top 4, but I came and watched at one point and saw what was going on. And I think you were on game 2, and I was just watching your opponent, local Maindeck team member Dustin, also playing Diablerie, and I was like, "Oh, nice, spicy one of." And he was like, "It's not mine, it's his." And then Taylor, you were like, "This is the second time he's done it against me too."
We played in the Swiss and we played again in top 4, and in game 1 of both matches, he took it from me, and I immediately cited it out after that because I was like, "This is not. We're not doing this again." It was so obnoxious.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But no, so that was sweet. It was cool. We had some people come up from Minneapolis for it as well, which was great. So we're getting some out of towners for it, which was to be expected because the weekend before I drove down to Minneapolis with Mitch to go participate in the store champ down at Fox Den as well, which was great. Jordan, Maindeck Jordan, and Kyle also play down there regularly. And Mitch won it the weekend before, so we've had a pretty good run of store champs here, and I think the Minneapolis crew is looking for some revenge. And fortunately for me, I was able to stop that. So
fended it off. I didn't help. I lost. One of my losses was to the Tristan player who came down. One of my wins was against the Arasana player who came down, which was very, very spicy. That was fun to see.
Yeah, shout out there to Garrett. Yeah, really cool to bring an Arasana list and be tuning that, and it's nice to see people continuing to innovate and try and make some things work. So we love to see it.
Absolutely.
Good. Yeah. Other than that, we're getting ready for Chicago. That'll be a week from when this comes out, which is awesome. It's great timing because then we're going to take a break from our basic element series here and do a Chicago recap, of course. Got to get all that sweet tournament recaps in while we can, and they're fresh, so we'll do that. But yeah, I think that's about it for kind of what we've been up to. So Dan, why don't you let the listeners know how they can support the channel?
Absolutely. So if you guys enjoy listening to Recollection Step and all of the other Maindeck podcast family of podcasts, I think I said podcast maybe one too many times there. If you guys enjoy listening to all this, thank you so much, podcast, for tuning in. Really appreciate. You can show us by giving a like down at the video below. You can comment down below as well. You can give us 5-star ratings on iTunes and stuff. We've been transitioning still. It's taking a little bit more time than expected, but we're doing transition for the audio only versions. So you may be seeing this late or something. I apologize about that. But if you've been, I got a comment on Twitter. I thought you guys stopped podcasting because the audio feeds weren't updating. I did not tell people appropriately what was going on. So that was my bad, but we haven't stopped, obviously, if you're listening to this in the moment. But hopefully I'm trying to, before we leave for like Gen Con, I'm trying to have all the feeds fixed up, but it's just part of it's out of my control, unfortunately. But when it's back up, 5-star ratings are super useful. And then if you want to support us financially, hop on a TCG player, but go to bit.ly/shoptcgs for our affiliate link. That's bit.ly/shoptcgs. You can do all your singles purchasing through TCG player to hook us up with that sweet little kickback that TCG player provides. Super appreciated. Costs you nothing extra. Thank you so much for your support in all the ways that you do support us. Taylor, why don't you tell us what we're talking about today? You already said it a little bit, but let's talk about it again. Oh, yeah, of course. We are talking about water today and how cool water is as an element in Grand Archive, and how, kind of what its game plan is, what it's trying to do, the things it does well, all that good stuff. Perfect way to cool off for the summer. Ooh, exactly. Yep. Yeah. Get yourself a nice tall glass of some ice cold water and just cool off a little bit. It's water has kind of, I think water's kind of struggled to find like a niche in competitive Grand Archive compared to Fire and Wind. And you can kind of see
where that's would be the case, just kind of based on how it kind of interacts in the game as well. Like water as an element it's got a lot of different tools. It's got a ton of different tools in its tool belt, and so it can kind of like adapt to any situation a lot, like your normal kind of atypical stereotypical water themes go in other media, right? It's kind of flows, goes with the flow and stream, and just kind of chills out a little bit. But because of that ability to kind of like adapt to a lot of different situations and having all these tools, it hasn't really ever had its time to shine, being great at one big thing. Like we've really kind of only seen water allies lists pop up for water decks. We've seen a couple more like dedicated level 3 water Diana lists as well. But other than that, it's that's kind of been the history of water in competitive Grand Archive. So kind of diving into like the philosophy and how it works.
Well, real
Well,
quick, until recently, right? Because we've seen some of Water's new
yes, until
identity.
recently. Yes, thank
Yes,
you.
with Nico
Nico,
lists
yes, yep. Which
those.
is it's not really a Water Allies list. Never mind.
No,
It's aggressive, I think, but yeah. Um. Anyway, so yeah, it can adapt to a lot of different situations, and it also has like much like ice, it's can build up a big defense as well. Uh, Whenever we're piloting certain decks where you kind of just need to make sure you can stymie off allies or whatever, we talk about building the wall, building your wall of defenses, and water is one of the best elements to do that. It has a ton of different cards for damage prevention, for controlling combat, for has some decent removal. Has a lot of really good defenses. Even has like proactive defenses where it's got some disruptive cards as well, and can kind of mess with the opponent's game plan a bit. Um, so yeah, it's kind of what water's all about. So let's kind of just dive in here to kind of these different elements here, or these different aspects of water, of the element, I should say, and kind of how they play. So the big one, the big pillar, I think, when everybody thinks of water, um, especially if they're familiar with Magic the Gathering and probably some other card games as well, they think of blue, they see water. They think of water, they see blue, and they think control. So blue is often like a control-ish color in a lot of games, and what that means is that it wants to control the game, it wants to control the flow of the game, control the tempo of the game, kind of just dictate the terms of the pace of play to the opponent, and make the opponent, you know, come to their level instead of trying to outrace their opponent or anything like that. So one of the big things that water has, one of the big tools it has for that is it has a lot of like combat effects. So whether that be like cards that just straight up end combat, cards that affect your opponent's power and lower your opponent's power as they're attacking, or even just straight damage prevention. It has a lot of different tools to just kind of control the flow of combat that way. Um, let's see. Like one of the big ones, I mean, Song of Frost is probably like the biggest offender here. I shouldn't say offender because I love Song of Frost. It's the biggest poster child of water and what it's trying to do. So Song of Frost, for those who don't know, it's a 2-cost fast action. And if a unit is I think actually, let me just pull it up. I've got it right here. If a unit is attacking, you end the combat phase, and that's it. So very simple card. It's got a cool little class bonus rider as well for Tamers, which really hasn't seen a lot of play. But you can also end up casting it for free if you've got floating memory in your graveyard. That part is less important. The cool part is just straight up ending the combat phase.
Song of Frost is an interesting defensive piece to talk about because it got a lot more notoriety early on from its offensive use instead, which, if you're new to the game, you probably don't understand how that could make any sense at all. It's completely non-intuitive. To me, though, that the interaction, which I'll explain in a moment, I'm not going to leave you hanging too long, it's just one of the best examples, I think, of where Grand Archive's mechanical structure and specifically just the way the cards are designed themselves, and how the interaction works through the game mechanics, um, can be extremely nuanced in a way that I find really fulfilling when you start to learn the depths of some of these plays, the tricks that you can perform, and it really opens the door. I feel like for a lot of games where the victory comes down to very clutch decision making in the moment and knowing every single way that you can really use your cards. So, Song of Frost, while often used to stop a large attack coming in at you, you just need to not die to this thing, or a cleave attack. Very good against that as well. Um, its offensive use was sort of popularized in this back in the early, I believe, the set 2 metagame, when people were starting to figure out how to attack quite a bit and win the game, and losing to Resolute Stand. Resolute Stand being a 3-cost action fast speed that lets you choose a unit, and that unit, you prevent 3 damage from each attack that unit would take that turn. Now, often you would swing with 1 unit, and the opponent would then Resolute Stand, and now for the rest of the turn, it's -3 from everything. You may have, if you have several allies out there, that blunts a whole lot of damage. What people discovered is that you can attack with your unit, and then if the opponent goes, okay, I will use Resolute Stand, you can then play Song of Frost in response before the Resolute Stand resolves. Important part. To end your current attack. But by the rules of Grand Archive, when the combat sequence ends, anything on the stack, any unresolved abilities or cards, will get banished without resolving. So you can
if I can interrupt quick.
Oh, please.
Just the reminder text is actually just explains a lot of this, which is great. So as a phase ends, banish all triggers, activations, and materializations on the effects stack, which is where this comes into play.
There we go. Yeah. So it is right on the card. Is a little. It reminds you that that's a thing, but it's just, you don't often think about that. Yeah, that exact line. And that ends up just banishing the Resolute Stand. So you lose 1 attack, but the rest of your attacks don't have to deal with the damage prevention. And that is enough to close games off a lot of the time.
That's one of my favorite examples of like water just sitting there and dictating the pace of play. Like the opponent's like, okay, I'm gonna save some cards. I'm gonna hold up at this sweet Resolute Stand, save either myself or my ally from getting beat down by your board of 3 or 4 or 5 allies, or how many ever you have. And water just says, no, I'm attacking, and I'm not going to let you stop that. Like I'm moving forward.
It is very much I don't know if it was intentional that the card was designed that way. It very well might have been, because Weaves of the Shore has seemed pretty clever about how they have worded everything to make certain interactions open. And if so, that is a great example of what you mentioned earlier, this water adaptability, kind of going with the flow. It's a card that has a primarily defensive use, but in the right situation with the right container, it will fill whatever it needs to. It'll flow along, and it will make do with the situation in a way that best works for it.
Yep. Another great example of a card that sits here and dictates combat is Korhazi Trapper, which has been this is a primarily defensive card as well, but we've seen it used not necessarily offensively, but to protect your offensive weapons. Where Korhazi Trapper is an ally, costs 3. I think it's a 1/3 if I'm remembering correctly. On enter, it puts a preparation counter on your champion, and then you can rest it and remove a preparation counter from your champion to give target units attacks -3 power until end of turn. I think it's end of turn, actually. It's not just this combat.
Yep.
And so this is another excellent card where you're trying to build out a board of allies. You have a bunch of 2/3s. You lay down this 1/3, and now all of a sudden it's really difficult for your opponent to attack into these 2/3s profitably with this trapper on the board. So again, just dictating like what your opponent can and can't do. Just sits there and says you're not going to kill anything, and then you're going to, like, if you play to the board, it's also a body and has power. Like most, the most prolific ally stats to this point have been 2/3. So you get the 1 power from the Korhazi Trapper, and that's just enough to combine with your other 2 power allies to kill off your opponent's stuff too. So just another piece there where water really gets to sit and just dictate what's going on. So
Yeah, and it also shows an interesting thing that I think we've noted more in water than others, which is that you have a lot of effects that are damage prevention, but I think water has more effects that are actually power reduction. It's a very nuanced little difference, but it does come into play, especially when you're talking about effects that are like anti-damage prevention effects will exist. Damage can't be prevented. Well, you can still reduce power in those situations and prevent that.
yeah, we've seen this kind of like wind allies combo list been popping up recently as well, that uses cards like Second Wind and Rallied events that they let you untap or awake certain allies that you've probably boosted the power on so they can attack again. And Korhazi Trapper shuts that down pretty well as well. It's not just stopping one attack, it's going to stop all of the attacks that ally's throwing out at you. So yeah, again, kind of an advantage to the damage reduction we've seen in the past. I mean, water still does have plenty of damage reduction effects though too. Like let's not downplay that, right? Like there's been a ton of them. Nico plays a bunch, like this new Nico list that's been running around since Mercurial Heart came out. Between Storm of Thorns and Diffusive Block, and I think sometimes Hailstorm Guard as well.
Mm-hmm.
A bunch of different just damage prevention effects as well. Those 3 cards all just either prevent the next damage that your champion would take, or just prevents a bunch of damage throughout the turn. So a ton of cards like that. It's just going to sit there and say, I'm going to protect my units, and I'm going to make sure you can't do anything about it.
Yeah, it's you mentioned earlier, and I don't know if this is just the right time to talk about this, but this philosophy of build the wall, which is something that we I think I can't remember who started. It was among our group. We started saying it almost jokingly, but just as like a serious advice.
Yeah, it was when we were playing a bunch of like that hybrid erupting list with Merlin 3 and Lorraine and all that. And it was always just like, how do we, I need to sit here and get to 3 so I can do stuff. And no, you need to build the wall first. You need to put up your defenses, and then you can go to 3 and finish your opponent off at that point.
Yeah, it became sort of a phrase because it was really about remembering to not always prioritize simply leveling, but instead using Materialized Phase to play things like Safeguard Amulet. Because against it was against erupting lists, but it was also against especially against assassin lists that were going at the time, because we noted things like putting out Safeguard Amulet would delay their kill turn often by more than 1 turn, because they did not want to even go into they didn't want to attempt to pop the dagger until they felt really confident about it. So you got to, it ended up just being a phrase that was, I think is widely applicable to a lot of game situations. And it's simply that water is probably the most innate tools to do that in its kit. Wind certainly is not bereft of options for wall building, but water, I think, has more that you commit to the board and force the opponent to, have to like figure out how to deal with, or they sit in there a lot, like things like Safeguard Amulet and Terrafring that we were using before as well. And I guess I just wanted to bring this up when we were talking about these control pieces, because I think it is a pretty common early conception in the game that Grand Archive is all about leveling as fast as possible. Those decks perform pretty well. By and large, like they get popularized because their play lines are straightforward, simple and effective. And it's you get to level 3. Sylvie is a great example. Sylvie is a deck where you do want to level as fast as possible. There are a few situations where it's not correct to level. That's because at her level 3, she stabilizes the game or ends the game super, super fast. But there are a lot of decks, and water is innately sort of in this territory, just based on how their kits tend to play, where you don't just kind of turn the corner when you get to 3, and you really have to use water's tools, which thankfully they build it to have, to build that defensive wall ahead of time, and take a little bit more time to play the game. And I would say, Taylor, that contributes too to Water's low placement overall in the metagame outside of all what are realistically fairly non-water water strategies like allies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, like, right. All these other strategies kind of, they hone in on something, on one thing, and they do it well. And a lot of the water decks have just been, the non-ally water decks, especially, like, they just have so many tools. It's difficult. You end up too much as like a jack of all trades, master of none, and you just don't have a way to really kind of attack the field in a broad enough sense where you can take these decks and like play super well with them. Nico is kind of the first one really, where she's been very focused in what she's doing, and she's gotten out essentially to kind of every situation where that out is just kill your opponent, right? Which is what we see from a lot of these other decks too, that place really well, right? It's these non-water decks like Fire Merlin and Wind Tristan. It's not that like they, have so many awesome pieces. It's just they've got they attack the metagame from a good angle, but then they also just have I win buttons where at some point they can end the game. And it just, you're going to win some unwinnable games because of that, where, it might be a bad matchup, but you draw into 3 fireballs as Merlin, and then now all of a sudden you're in really good shape. Or, you see a Mastermind Scheme at the right time as Tristan and can get a bunch of prep counters and kill with a lethal Shadow Strike for, 16 plus damage. So it's something Water's been lacking, is just something like, mostly I win buttons. And we're starting to see that now more with Nico, where she's got a lot of really large attacks. Icebound Slam is an attack that attacks for 5, or attacks for potentially 8 and costs 5, which is a large cost, but 8's also a lot of damage, especially if you're pressuring them throughout the game. So we're starting to see Water kind of catch up in that regard as well. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. As kind of we get into some other strengths of Water, and kind of some of its areas of expertise in the game. Still kind of like rounding out here the control effects that Water has. Water is kind of also fairly unique in that it does a lot of memory manipulation that you won't see from other elements. Usually like, talking about your opponent's memory, not your own. Cards like Chilling Touch, which will banish a card at random from your opponent's memory for a turn, or Mind Freeze, which will banish level cards at random from your opponent's memory. So if you're like level 3, it banishes 3. If you're level 8, because you're Merlin, it banishes 8.
That's I mean, the times I've seen that happen are just so satisfying to to watch. The opponent puts down their whole hand into memory to do stuff. They get watered, so they don't win the game or whatever. And then you go, okay, well, you don't have a next turn, basically, because you just take their entire memory away from them for a turn.
Yes. That can also be one of Water's I win buttons as well. Just being able to take their memory away if you time it correctly. But again, it's a little harder to set up. But that's one of my favorite effects. I've been trying to make a Water Merlin deck work here for this Mercurial Heart season, and I'm getting pretty close. And Mind Freeze is like one of the best cards in that deck because of those turns where you've got enough tempo elements where you can take advantage of your opponent not being able to do anything. So yeah, anyway, you've got those. You also have Fractal of Intrusion, which is like a 3 or 4 cost fractal that with reservable on enter. You can banish a card with floating memory from your graveyard, and then you can look at your opponent's memory and discard a card from that. So Water has a bunch of different ways to kind of just disrupt what the opponent is actually able to do, on top of just disrupting its already current plans.
Yeah, and that also goes into effects that negate as well. I would say. I think those are 2 very like similar type of effects at attacking the same thing. It's limiting the opponent's options ultimately to be able to do things, from preventing them from having memory. The memory manipulation too can be like, it can be destructive depending on the situation. I have won games from playing a Chilling Touch at the right time for sure, to prevent the opposing Rye from leveling up or something. It's one of those effects that punishes greatly. Same with negation, that punishes greatly an opponent who is stumbling a little bit, who is just kind of putting it together. They kind of need everything to line up right, and then they'll be okay. And water has a lot of these effects where they don't just outright like take the opponent out or something, but they say, hey, if you are having a little bit of trouble right now, it's about to get a lot worse for you, basically. Whereas if the opponent kind of has everything coming up all their way, like Chilling Touch, it feels like it just doesn't do stuff a lot of the time. You can negate something that they play to completely prevent it from resolving. But then if they just have another Storm Slime in hand or something, then you go, okay, well, you got me then. So
Yep.
it's, I would, I think that's part of it too, is that like water is a fairly, it's a fairly difficult element to play correctly, I think. And I think that's reflected in the starter decks as well, where the starter decks that water has had so far are some of the harder ones to win with. Part of that is that the Sylvie starter deck was just not very good.
Yeah, the deck was horrible. It was so bad.
Yep. But then they had Arasana in Alchemical Revolution. And that deck, well, I mean, it also isn't great. But
that one's really bad, but it has win conditions, which
right.
it like you can see a path to actually winning the game with that. Whereas Sylvia is just so difficult to string anything together with her starter. But like Arasana, like there's a clear path of control the board, control the game, get to level 3, and then win through star calling.
And that deck has all of these elements in it. It has recovery, it has damage prevention, it has negation, it has a lot of things that are going to do what you need water to do. But then the problem is, especially when you're a new player, knowing how to apply them is the most important thing. It's not hard to figure out how to apply a fireball. I'm not saying it's obvious. Sometimes you need to actually use it defensively, and sometimes you just need to save it to win the game. That's the classic like Rye starter deck issue that people have, is they just start blasting all the units on board, and then they get to late game and go, I don't have any cards left in hand. But that's something you figure out fairly obviously. Whereas water, just it never feels like it's quite an obvious line to winning the game, which I think bleeds into its win rate at tournaments, the frequency with which people even bring it to events. And it just feels to me like water has this long-standing problem that people just haven't quite been able to learn the element well enough, just due to lack of experience, myself included. I'm not saying that we got to figure it out and you guys don't or anything, but it's just taking time. And I wouldn't be surprised in like a number of years for water to just be but far and away the dominant element, when people have like finally overall, like we've built our massive knowledge up about understanding the game, and certain effects have been put in to help people like figure it out better, where it's like, oh no, it's just oppressively strong now. No one can do anything against water.
Yeah. I mean, just hearkening, like there's so many cards in water that are very reactive, and it's difficult to know what you need to react to if you don't have as much experience with the game, right? Like,
yeah.
Like what's important to react to and what's not. Even a card like Fracturize, which on its face looks pretty innocuous, this Fracturize is a card, fast action, cost 2. It turns a Regalia target item or weapon becomes a cleric fractal Fantasia with reservable and loses all of their abilities. So like this is just kind of like on its face, it looks like it's decent removal. It'll take whatever item or weapon your opponent plays and remove its effects, and gives your opponent a resource in return, though. So trying to figure out like which of their effects are worth giving them a resource for, and essentially an extra card in hand is not trivial either. And this is like one of the simpler, better effects in water, right?
Plus, again, that water adaptability thing, Fracturize can be used on your own cards to you lose the card in hand, but then you gain a reservable thing, so it like washes out, but then you get the floating memory from it. I have done this play a few times, especially when I was playing around with Arasana. Arasana is great because all of her herbs are items. So you can Fracturize an herb to like immediately just kind of get that floating memory online. But I have done it I've done it just in other decks, straight materializing. I don't really need terraforming in this match. I put it out there just so I could basically turn my materialize into a really, really, really like wish.com wish or a Shein. Let's go with Shein today. A
Timu.
Shein version of Grand Crusader's Ring, where I didn't draw a card, but I got a floating memory in the graveyard from it, from my materialized phase.
Exactly. Just small things like that. Like these are all like really small, like incremental plays that as a water player you have to find in order to like gain an advantage in the game. Whereas like, fireballing your opponent for 8 is a very obvious advantage, like very large advantage that you like. It just, you don't get the same. You've really got to work for your wins in water for the most part.
Yeah,
is what I'm trying to say. And while we're talking about Fracturize, I think obviously we've got some new listeners, I'm sure. So we've got to talk about its interaction with Nullifying Lantern as well, which is one of the like best ways to get advantage in water. Nullifying Lantern is a 0-cost regalia that causes all cards in graveyards to lose their elements. They're essentially just all norm element cards. As a water player, if you don't care about what your graveyard looks like or the elemental composition of your graveyard, you can fracturize your Nullifying Lantern and it will lose all abilities. But due to the way the game rules work, we will not go into detail here on. Just long story short, Nullifying Lantern becomes a reservable for you, and then it also its effect still maintains its effect. Graveyards will still be considered norm.
I'm going to say two things. Number one, we did a full explanation of this on Recollection Step in the past. Mm-hmm. There's some episode. What is the name? Actually, hang on a sec. I will pull up the name of the episode for you guys in just a moment here. But the reason that this happens is it's due to something called layering. And like, really, I should just leave it there. But the basic idea is that effects have to apply in a certain order in order for the game rules to work at the end of the day. If you can imagine a world where there's a lot of different kinds of game card effects, ultimately at some point you have to decide how do these things kind of stack up to make sure the game still runs once you're done. And the way it stacks up is that if you make your lantern lose abilities, it actually still has that specific ability that changes the element of things. So the full explanation of that is in the episode. We have is it tournament preparation? I think it's tournament preparation.
Yeah, Taylor. I'm pretty sure it's tournament preparation. We went through a lot of different like rules and stuff in there. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, because we're talking about you have to all the effects that you should know, otherwise you're going to be real surprised when they're like used against you. Or in this case, so you can use them yourself to get advantage. So yeah, long story short, that's how Lantern and Fracturize works. If you want the full explanation, the deeper explanation, you can find it in episode 4, tournament preparation. But it's all about the layers, baby. It's good to know.
Yeah. Yes. So, Water's doing a lot of cool control-y stuff. In that same vein, they also have a bit of recovery, a life game and removing damage counters from your champion. I was hesitant to include this as kind of part of Water's domain because there's not a ton of water cards with it. I don't know if there were any actually in Alchemical Revolution or Mercurial Heart. I did a quick perusal before we started. Gather slimes. Yes. Okay. Actually, you know what? That's enough for me to just go all in. Where
you can always count on me for a slime reference.
Got super. Thank you, Dan. Water's got super recovery. But there's a few cards that either have kind of incidental recovery or recovery is kind of their main function, where you just you've taken some damage throughout the course of the game and you've prevented some damage. Probably like it's probably been your game plan to slow your opponent down, and you're kind of worried about whatever kind of final reach they have, whether that's a fireball for 10, 12, 20, or a shadow strike for 17, or just a huge board of allies. At some point your opponent's gonna your opponent's doing stuff too, and they're generating resources, and sitting at a high life, like a high damage count, is just dangerous. So a lot of these recovery cards help you as a water player to get out of those dangerous situations, maintain your control of the game and the board, and fight through your opponent at a safe life total, and get to the point where you can actually win the game. So this is still like kind of I know we've had some recent examples in Gather Slimes, which is awesome, but it is still kind of like not a super common effect in water yet. But we also just haven't seen it in other elements like fire and wind I don't think have any recovery if I'm remembering correctly.
No.
Fast cure is like another one that's pretty common, but that's norm. And we just don't see a lot of it outside of, advanced elements here at this point too. So this is very, very much in, I think, water's camp at this point. Although I don't know how often we'll see it in the future, if it's going to become more common or not. But yeah, it's one of water's best tools to like stabilize after they've kind of grabbed control of the game and really dominated the pace of play and told the opponent what they can and can't do. This is how they make sure they don't actually lose to some odd stuff coming out in the towards the end of the game.
Recovery is one of those kinds of card game mechanics that, depending on how the game is built, it can get out of control if there's too much easy access to it. Grand Archive is the kind of game where I don't actually think it would be too problematic based on how the game is built. That said, it's not a water deck, but Luxem Fire Xander did show how a metagame can be affected by a deck that has consistent access to a lot of late game healing. You and I, we had the take on this podcast plenty of times that it's a perfectly reasonable deck in the metagame. It was a part of the metagame. It shifted things, how things played out. Ally decks still performed well, even when Luxem was well represented in tournaments as well. So yeah, I think that really does show that. I think that argument holds water. That I think recovery could continue to be introduced. It wouldn't be a big deal, and there are enough decks that can fight through it, that can counter it in certain ways, that can just end the game in one shot anyway, or two shots or whatever needed. To where I don't. Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to there's the interaction, the way the game is built interaction wise. There's always going to be a way around a lot of problems.
Yeah. I suspect like as long as there's not too much incidental recovery included onto cards, just like for free, like random recover 1, recover 2 on just effects you'd already play cards for, we'll see recovery not be an issue. Oftentimes like dedicated life gain decks in other games too, like they're fun, but they don't, the issue is they don't ever win the game, right? Like you just get a really high life total, but then you can't actually kill your opponent anyway. Like they can't kill you, which is cool, but you can't actually win a game, which is fine. But you also don't want to end the tournament with a bunch of draws under your belt because neither player could kill the other one.
Well, most people don't. Some people have fun doing that.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yes, yeah. They're like it's a niche thing. It's cool. Grand Archive though also avoids that problem because all of their life is counted like with damage counters. So you count up from 0 to whatever your champion's life total is, and not down from 20 or 40 or whatever the game is, right? So you can only recover, because recovering is removing damage counters. You can only remove damage counters that are there. You can't have like negative damage counters. So if you're at like 0 or 1 or 2 life and you recover 5, it does almost nothing for you. So yeah, I think we won't be really seeing that get too out of hand either. And yeah, talking about Luxem, like that's not even in the metagame right now, the competitive metagame anyway. Like we just have not seen it put up any results. I think it has some issues at the moment. There's some pretty big thorns in its side that are really keeping it down. So
I think both Tristan and Sylvie have a good matchup into it.
Yeah.
There's just we're not going to get into the depth there, but back to, again, we have a previous podcast episode, the Tristan and Sylvie Menace, where we talk about those two decks specifically, and they're both good. I think that's not a great matchup for them.
Yes. So yeah, recovery though, cool. It's a great tool for water to have access to. Moving on, water just has also like a ton of floating memory. So it's the king of like getting multiple uses out of its cards. It has the most unrestricted amount of cards with floating, or the most amount of cards with unrestricted floating memory. So that means like floating memory that's not locked behind class bonus or level 2+ or something like that, out of all the basic elements by like a very wide margin. And it also has a bunch of cards that will consume floating memory for extra effects. So oftentimes floating memory it's used to pay for your materialization costs. And it's very good at that. But because water has such a plethora of floating memory, it can be very useful to be able to eat that for bonuses. Like, the best example is Frostborn Paladin, which is a 2/3 for 3 ally. On enter, you can eat a floating or banish a floating memory from your graveyard, and if you do, you put a buff counter on Frostborn and you draw a card. So just straight up like turning floating memory into extra cards, which is great. Just it. I'm not really sure where to go from that, but it's very good. Water gets a lot of uses out of its cards. Like it's like those. It just makes sure it uses every part of the buffalo, as we say up here in the northern Midwest.
I do use that phrase pretty commonly. I think where we go from that is just the next section, to be honest, because these two things are so intrinsically linked. But floating memory, as you said, it allows you to get multiple uses out of things. But the big identity, and where, as we sort of have been teasing throughout the episode, where people have finally found success building water for water itself and not just for its plethora of 2/3 allies that are reasonable to play, is in self-mill, or in other words, the act of discarding cards from your own deck, because that is the obvious advantage to gain when you have an element who has a lot of cards that have value while they're in the graveyard. Doesn't matter how they got there, right? So Nico has really shown with a lot of success lately, more than you and I think more than you and I expected, because you and I both right away were on Nico and like, this is a really fun list. Like, really like the self-mill thing. We played it I remember the first couple tournaments, you and I played this and we were like, this does seem to have some legs, but the metagame was so unexplored at the time that I think both of us were reluctant necessarily to put a lot of faith into it as like a competitive deck, because there were a lot of ways to sort of stymie its attacks. Like, I think we had one match where I played slimes against you and just reclaimed an intercept slime enough times where you're like, no, I don't think this is going to go anywhere.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty close. Like, we weren't playing good answers for a lot of that stuff yet either. I don't think either of us had snow fairies in the main board in our lists. Like, I think they were sided.
A couple tournaments in, I think we started to get the snow fairies in, and then you and I diverted to playing some other stuff.
Yeah, there were so many things to try out at the beginning of the format, that we just didn't put the time into it. And like, we had a month before competitive tournaments started up again. So it was just like prime time to just explore whatever the heck you wanted. So we were playing all kinds of stuff. Like, we had Water Nico, we had a Water Polcock list we were running around with that looked kind of similar to
still a fun list.
Yep. Which, again, is another excellent deck that was using the graveyard for value. This time using Dahlia and Desperate Dive, which are two cards that become much more effective based on how many water cards you have in your graveyard, which is similar to quite a few cards in the Nico list as well. So not even are you just finding like resources in the graveyard for water, just like straight card resources. You're finding ways to make your cards better as well. Oftentimes water scales based on how many water cards you have in your graveyard. So
I want to call back to our last episode, the fire one, because Taylor, in that episode, you had mentioned specifically that fire consumes the graveyard for value, whereas water just builds into it for value. And then wind actually plays which we'll talk about in the future episodes of the series, but actually doesn't do anything with their own graveyard, but has the effects that will remove cards from the opponent's graveyards. Yes. Right. So you have sort of an interesting little, it's not quite a triangle, but it's some sort of a divergent couple of lines there, I guess.
Yep. Each element is going to interact with the graveyard in a different way, in kind of its own special way.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty cool. I really like how that's built. Water is the one where fire is the one. I want to start with fire. Fire is the one where you are going to expend everything and then be out. Fire is not there to last a long time, right? Where water is the one where it says, given enough time, my effects will overwhelm you at some point. And it can keep it can keep on playing them and they can get answered as long as it can draw another one. It can keep doing it. It just has to live that long, which I think it really encapsulates the difference between those two play styles quite a bit as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep, 100%. Like, if anybody who is familiar with League of Legends, you go hop into a game, your team is getting like beat in the early game, and you've got a bunch of like late game champions on your team, and you're like, oh, don't worry, guys, just hang in there. We're gonna outscale. We're gonna get to level 18 and we're gonna beat them. And that's kind of what Water is. Water is like the Vagar of the card game world. If that makes any sense to any League of Legends players out there, but yeah, it's interesting to see the difference between the two, and it's really funny actually to see kind of now as these elements kind of come into their own. We've had 4 sets for Weebs of the Shore to really kind of flesh them out. It's interesting to see how Fire has really gone into this kind of consumption mentality or aspect, and Water's gone into this build it up aspect, where Fiery Momentum is kind of like a fun little overlap between the two, where that's an attack from the first set for 3. It's a fire attack, if you couldn't tell by the name, and it has the same kind of scaling ability these Water cards have now, where it gets +1 power for each fire card you have in your graveyard. So I wonder if that card had not been printed in set 1, if it would become like a Water card here in set 5 or 6 or 7.
I think at least if it were printed now, it would consume the cards instead of simply scaling off of them. I think just to kind of preserve that identity, I imagine. It's very common in newer card games, when a card game's fresh, for the design to sort of, it gets iterated on is the best way of putting it over time. You put your first designs out in the set, you see how they play. You can only do so much testing, internally. And as you continue to iterate and hone in on how you like everything to play, you realize certain mistakes were made. This isn't quite how we would have designed this now. I bet. Boy, you know what? That's an interesting. I might try to set up. I've been trying to set up some sort of an interview or something. I might set up a little interview at some point and see if I can get like Sil on or so. He doesn't do them too often, but maybe I can get Sil. I'd love to talk about cards that you would design differently.
Oh yeah.
This deep in the game. I think that's actually a really interesting topic. So I'm saying this now, number one, because he listens to the podcast. So Sil, I'm going to be after you about that. I'm going to chat to you about that. But number two, so that someone can keep me honest about trying to remember to do that.
Oh yeah.
So Taylor, I'm counting on you for that.
I'll be bugging
listeners.
you about this. I like, this is a really good interview topic. I'm excited to see this video. Actually, I'm going to will it into existence at this point.
Let's go. All right. Nice.
But yeah, I mean, so Water's also like got a bunch of ways now too. They're getting some like really actually good self mill effects to kind of, to really power these, not power, but enable these kind of graveyard matters strategies. In the first couple of sets we had some, and they just weren't like worth playing. What's Drown in Thought is, I think, the card. It's a 2-cost action, and it just mills 2 cards from target player. No, it's not Drown in Thought.
That's not what it's called. I'm like, I can't even remember the name of the card. It was Sink into Oblivion.
There we go. Yeah. Sink
into Oblivion. Yep,
Sink into Oblivion. Finally. Yep. Okay. And it's the top 3, not the top 2.
It's a slow mage spell though for 3.
Yeah. Yep. And it's just like, that's rough. Like that's not really worth a card unless you're getting like 3 floating memory, or you're really need those cards in your graveyard right now. Versus like cards we have now from set 3 and 4, we've got Dahlia, which is a 3-cost water ally. It's a ranger and it has class bonus, but on attack, then you get to look at the top card of your deck, and if it's a water card, you can put it into your graveyard, which is a perfectly reasonable card to play. It's a 1/3 on its own. That's, if you want that effect, that's awesome. We got Vaporjet's Shield Bearer, which is I think it's a 2-cost. 2-cost 1/3, which is dope. A guardian with class bonus of on hit, look at the top card of your deck and you can put that into your graveyard. So like, just very nice, efficient, not necessarily like super hyper efficient, but efficient enough to make them worth playing effects to get cards in your graveyard. You got things like Icebound Slam now, which is really enabling this new Nico deck, which is a 7-cost Guardian attack for 3. With class bonus, it costs 2 less to activate. And then on attack, you get to put the top 5 cards of your deck into your graveyard. Then if there are 5 or more water cards in your graveyard, Icebound Slam gets +5 power. So like just a huge bomb of a card, which does like everything you want in that Nico deck. But most importantly, it just dumped a bunch of stuff into your graveyard very efficiently. Like we're finally seeing now it does like these effects that mill yourself put onto cards at a non-detrimental cost, which is there's still a cost, right? Like Icebound Slam probably doesn't cost 7 if it doesn't mill 5, right?
Yeah,
but it's definitely like a card you want to play at this point. So it's nice to see these things really come into fruition.
I think one of the interesting things, just talking again about how development has sort of iterated and honed in on things, is actually, I don't know if everybody thought of this way from the start, but for me, it wasn't until like listening to a discussion, I think from Silidar at some point recently, that I realized the intent of the basic resource system design in the game, which is that on your turn, you put down cards from your hand in order to play cards. You are basically given a set number of actions per turn. Think of it like if you know the rules for Yu-Gi-Oh! In Yu-Gi-Oh! You can summon 1 monster per turn. And they wanted to channel that idea, but give you some granularity in it. Mm-hmm. So you can spend your turn playing one big thing, Icebound Slam, for example. You can put down basically your hand and play this card and go, cool, that's my turn. The cost is you don't leave anything up to play anything. You don't get to play an ally in addition to it a lot of the time. Or you can play multiple smaller things on your turn. So it's a lot better. Like it could have just been a system. Honestly, Grand Archive could have been designed with a system where it just said you can play 1 5-star and above thing or 2 4-star and below things. Like not that different than Yu-Gi-Oh! Sort of a system at the end of the day, ignoring things like traps and spell cards, whatever. But like, instead they decided to put some granularity on it, right? Where you could play 3 or 4 or 5 things, just depending on card draw and how the cost of everything. But I think one thing they realized, especially in these early mill effects, is that the number of the cost on the cards, or in other words, the amount of stuff you could do on a turn in addition to that effect, was not in line with the effect you actually got from it. So I like using the Icebound Slam as an example here, because it costs a ton. Obviously, it's just like this, it's going to take your whole turn, right? Mm-hmm. But it mills a whole turn worth of value. If you had a lesser effect, if you try playing Sink into Oblivion, it takes up too much of your turn, too many of your resources. 4 cards, ultimately 3 for the cost and 1 for the card. Mm-hmm. 4 cards are spent on that effect, leaving you with not a lot else you can do. It's not going deep enough or whatever. I think they ultimately kind of have been honing in on this idea of like, when a card needs to do something, it's okay to, like, at some point when you make the cost high enough, it didn't matter. Like Sink into Oblivion basically was a 7-cost card. Yep. Because if that's kind of what I'm trying to say, if that makes sense, because the amount you could do in addition to sinking wasn't in line with what you needed to do. So it was more or less you gave up your turn to play a Sink into Oblivion on yourself. And they just said, no, let's just make it worth the turn. And then they printed Icebound Slam.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. That's really insightful. Thinking about it that way. One of the other like kind of issues though with a lot of these two like cards that were in effect that you didn't necessarily need to take your whole turn, or like you wanted to add some granularity to, is that by playing cards that do only that, it also just removes your like ability to play cards from your future turns too, because you're losing that card permanently in order to play it. So now not only are you like hamstringing your turn now, like you're playing a Sink into Oblivion and not being able to do anything else, you're also not going to be able to play like an Icebound Slam the next turn because you're down that card.
And Icebound Slam puts you down a card too, but it progresses the game in some way. It does damage to your opponent, or it deals with something on board. If it deals with something on board, you traded a card for a card. If you deal damage to your opponent, you spent a card to deal damage. And that's the other thing you have to think about in Grand Archive. At some point, your cards have to translate to damage. You can't go the whole game without your cards translating to damage at some point, right? And so whether that's front loaded at the start of the game or back loaded at the end of the game, either way, does have to happen at some point. And cards like Singing Oblivion only will matter for that if you target your opponent with them, in which case you're losing all possible value you would gain from them anyway in the early game.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. I don't, Dan, do you have any kind of final thoughts here on these graveyard aspects? I think we went into that pretty well, and I'm trying to rack my brain here if there's anything left that we left on the table.
I think we did cover it pretty well. I just want to give some final thoughts on like water in general, which then I'll leave you for the final word on that as the holder of a Sabrina. You certainly.
I actually have it right here. I don't ever leave this off my desk unless I'm taking it to play with.
Beautiful,
it's so great.
That certainly I think makes you more qualified to speak to water than me. Even though you didn't actually play water.
I played wind in that tournament, so I'm not sure about that, but
yeah, it's fine. No, it's just take it. It's fine. Water is, I find water one of the most intriguing elements to play in the game. I really, really like the nuance. I love the control. I'm a control player at heart in card games, despite my love for Sylvie right now. I find I gravitate towards playing decks that control the game the most a lot of the time. And I have messed around with my fair share of water decks. I have toyed around with some weird builds. As we were talking today, actually, I'm going to put together a list for a fire water Nico, and I'm going to try that. It's going to be kind of weird. It's just an interesting idea that I'm going to work with, but that's not control either. I'm just saying I toy around with water all the time. And I really do enjoy water. I have found it difficult to be effective with from time to time. Water Sylvie, for example, is that people have been asking me, where's the Water Sylvie list? It wasn't good, guys. I couldn't.
It was really bad. It was horrible.
I tried, and I didn't have the sauce. I'm not going to.
Shout out to True Champion Gaming, and here's a little bone for our listeners. We'll throw them a bone. But True Champion Gaming, they put up a Water Sylvie list on their channel here late last week, I think. That looks like a pretty solid list. It's much better than what Dan had. You don't want Dan's anymore. Just go look at theirs.
You didn't want mine in the first place. Go look at True Champion Gaming's Water Sylvie list. But I mean, just shows it is a difficult element to play. That said, for the people who want to dig into it and want to learn the nuances and want to learn when to play your control effects and which ones to even choose to play in the first place, which was probably why my Sylvie list was losing. It can be a massively rewarding element to play as well. And like I said, I would not be surprised if in a few years, people are just complaining about how oppressive water is in the game, assuming things go that long, which based on the current trajectory, I have no questions about. So those are my kind of final thoughts on water. How about you, Taylor?
Yeah. No, I mean, water's my favorite element for sure. Mostly because it's blue. Blue's my favorite Power Ranger. I'm a big fan of blue. But
I base everything on my favorite Power Ranger.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I do really like water quite a bit. Actually, as of this year, it's become a tradition where I just spend the summer trying to make Water Merlin work. I tried to do that too when Fractured Crown came out. I was like, Water Merlin's great. You play a Mind Freeze for 8, and you get rid of your opponent's whole hand for a turn. This is insane. So I've been trying to make that work, but it's very difficult. You've got to know the game really well. You've got to know what you're the hardest part is just knowing what you're going to play against, and knowing how to play against it, which can be really difficult because there's a lot of varied threats in this game. So it's oftentimes when we're talking about control decks, people say you can, there's no wrong questions, but there are wrong answers, which means that, your opponent's going to throw a bunch of stuff at you. And as long as that stuff deals damage, it doesn't really matter what it is. But if you don't have the right card to stop that damage, you're going to be in rough shape. That's really where a water, where people are going to struggle with water is just kind of figuring out how to answer these cards that are coming at them. So a lot of times though too is we'll see that water is not just about hard control and taking control of the game and blocking it down. You can take control of the game as well just by playing at the pace you want to play at. one of the ways I've taken like this Water Merlin deck I'm working on is I built it with Ascension, Spirit Blade Ascension, so I can use Prismatic Edge to kind of help close the games out faster. Like I include fire cards in my water deck just so I can get the extra 3 damage off Prismatic Edge with that. And because like once you get to level 3, you really just want to start tempoing them out, and you do a little bit of that beforehand, but like you just really, you got to put the gas on when you get to level 3 so that you can end the game before your opponent really can recover and come back. So a lot of it is really just figuring out like the plays that are going to buy you the most time and allow you to do the most damage. So but yeah, I agree, it's a very rewarding element to play. There's a lot of puzzles that you got to figure out. And you've always are going to have to think on your feet with this element because you just have so many options at a lot of the different points in the game. So, but yeah, I think that wraps up here our water recap, or not recap, but our water walkthrough for you. Yeah, next time we'll be talking about Chicago and how that went, and hopefully it went well, but we'll let you know. And then after that, we'll probably get back to Wind unless there's some really cool stuff to talk about in the meantime.
I mean, that'll be a while. I bet there will be some cool stuff to talk about. So we'll see.
That's like
Wind will be
out.
At some point, for sure.
We'll get to it. We aren't going to forget about it.
You know what?
The timing is just inopportune.
That's really thematic with Wind, actually. It's going to take its time. Eventually, we will release the Wind podcast, but just like playing a Wind deck in a tournament, it is going to take its time.
Oh. Yeah, okay, so we call water the control color, but water does not have a hard time closing out games when it wants to. But man, Wind, that just can drag games out forever.
I think that'll be the interesting discussion too, though, is like the difference in how these two elements approach things, and Wind also is not exclusively kind of focused on late game play. So, well, yeah, it'll be a fun discussion when we get there eventually.
Yes. So anyway, yeah, thank you listeners for staying tuned and going along on this journey with us. So we'll talk to you again in another 2 weeks, but thanks everyone and catch you later.
Bye everyone.
Bye.